my dear Gemini. There's a very unique energy showing up right from the very first cards. And honestly, it doesn't feel like explosive emotions or words that come rushing out all at once. It's more like the feeling of someone who has kept everything inside for so long that even they can no longer tell the difference between their thoughts and the ache of missing you. This person is thinking about you far more than they let on. What's interesting is that on the outside, they may seem completely fine. They still go to work. They still answer messages. They still have their everyday conversations like everyone else. If someone looked at their life right now, they would probably assume everything is perfectly normal. But what's happening beneath the surface tells a very different story. There are these small moments throughout the day that bring you back into their mind. A song that randomly comes on while they're driving, a familiar coffee shop, a phrase someone happens to say, a scene from a movie they watch on their phone. And somehow, all of it has the ability to pull them right back into memories connected to you. The Six of Cups card comes through with exactly that feeling, not in a way that says they're living in the past. It's more like certain memories never truly left. They're still there, quietly existing in a private corner of their heart that nobody else gets to see. Okay. The thing that confuses them is that they genuinely thought time would take care of this. They thought if they stayed busy enough, if they focused more on work, if they simply stopped thinking about you, eventually the feelings would fade. But it hasn't worked that way. Some people enter our lives and disappear almost as quickly as they arrive. And then there are people who leave behind a space that feels much larger than the time they actually spent there. You seem to belong in that second category. The Moon card makes this energy even deeper, because there are so many emotions here that were never spoken out loud. This person tends to keep things to themselves. They think constantly, but they're not the type to sit down and openly share everything that's on their mind. Instead, they watch, they remember, they have conversations with themselves. Sometimes they even imagine conversations that never happened. It's almost like they've replayed the idea of seeing you again over and over in their head. What would they say? Where would they even begin? And if someone asked them how they truly feel, would they be brave enough to answer honestly? That's where this strange inner conflict comes from. Part of them wants to keep moving forward, but another part of them is still looking over their shoulder. And honestly, that tension has made them quieter than usual. Wow. I also feel the Page of Cups card showing up like an emotion that's trying to find its way out. It's like a message that's typed out and then deleted. A phone call that's been considered 100 times but never made. A simple check-in text that somehow feels much harder than it should. Not because they don't want to reach out, but because they care more than they expected to. And sometimes the people with the deepest feelings are the ones who hesitate the longest. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing. They're afraid of being misunderstood. They're afraid that the distance has grown so large they no longer know how to cross it. What really stands out to me is that this energy isn't only showing up on their side. Some of you watching this reading may have felt something recently too. Not necessarily a clear thought. Not necessarily a specific sign. Just those unexpected moments when someone suddenly crosses your mind. A name that appears out of nowhere. An old memory that returns when you weren't even trying to think about it. A feeling that's difficult to explain, as if something remains unfinished. And honestly, that's why I don't feel like this story has completely closed in this person's heart. They're still standing somewhere between what happened and everything they never found the courage to say. Like someone holding their phone for a very long time without ever pressing send. Like someone who has replayed a conversation so many times that they no longer know what the right opening line would be. And when I look at the overall energy of this first part, the strongest feeling isn't distance. It isn't separation. It's the sense that the silence is becoming harder and harder for them to hold on to. And maybe the reason this silence has started to feel so heavy isn't because of how much distance exists between the two of you. It's because this person finally starts seeing things they never wanted to look at directly before. You know, sometimes we only understand the value of something once it is no longer sitting right there within reach. Not because we're careless, not even because we don't care, but when someone is always there, always showing up, always offering patience and understanding, it's easy to start treating that presence as something that will always be available. Honestly, I feel like that's exactly what's happening inside this person's mind right now. The Judgment card comes through here like a moment of reflection, not in a harsh or self-critical way. It's more like sitting alone in your car after a long day, turning off the music, and for the first time allowing yourself to really think about everything that happened. This person is doing that. They're remembering old conversations. They're remembering the times you tried to explain how you felt. They're remembering the moments when you reached out first. They're remembering the signs they overlooked back then. Because when we're inside a connection, there are certain things we don't always recognize. But once the noise fades, once things become quieter, the smallest details suddenly become impossible to ignore. And they're starting to realize that you tried much harder than they ever understood. Maybe at one point they thought what you did was just normal, that you were simply strong, simply patient, simply understanding. But now they're beginning to see that behind all of that was a real person with real emotions. You waited too. You felt disappointed too. You hoped for clearer answers too. And honestly, what seems to weigh on them the most is realizing that when you needed answers, they chose silence. When you needed clarity, they left things hanging in the air. When they could have stepped toward you, they stayed exactly where they were. The Seven of Pentacles card keeps bringing me back to that feeling. It's almost like someone looking back over an entire chapter of their life and wondering, what if I had done things differently? What if I had been more honest? What if I had taken more initiative? What if I hadn't been so afraid? Those questions keep circling through their mind. And what's interesting is that the more they think about it, the harder it becomes to ignore what they feel. Because for the first time, they're not focusing on what they lost. They're focusing on what you gave. Now, some people only miss someone when they feel lonely. But honestly, that's not what this energy feels like. This person is revisiting the entire story from a completely different perspective. They're beginning to understand that what made you special wasn't found in some dramatic moment. It was found in hundreds of little moments, a thoughtful text message, a word of encouragement, a conversation that lasted late into the night, someone who genuinely listened. Those were the things they quietly assumed would always be there. Until suddenly, they weren't. The Five of Pentacles card carries a feeling that's hard to ignore. It's like walking into a familiar room and realizing something has changed. Everything looks the same, but it doesn't feel the same anymore. That's the realization this person seems to be moving through. It's not complete loss, not exactly, but it's enough to make them understand that your absence feels much bigger than they ever imagined. And what creates the most pressure isn't the past. It's the thought that you may be moving forward with your life, not out of anger, not to prove anything, but simply because you're learning how to live without them beside you. Okay, that thought doesn't sit comfortably with them. Because for the first time, instead of believing there would always be more time, they're beginning to understand the value of the present moment. And the more they look back on everything that's happened, the more it feels like there's an unfinished conversation still living inside them. A conversation that never really ended. A conversation that seems to grow a little louder every day. Because with each passing day, new words appear, words that probably should have been spoken a very long time ago. It almost feels like the harder this person tries to leave everything behind, the more they realize they never really left this story at all. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way where they're constantly showing up or looking for reasons to insert themselves into your life. It's more like someone standing quietly at a distance, far enough not to be seen, but close enough to still wonder how you're doing. The Page of Swords card comes through with a very specific energy. Honestly, it makes me think about all those moments when this person finds themselves looking for information about you without even realizing they're doing it. Maybe it starts with something completely ordinary. An evening spent scrolling through their phone. A few quiet minutes between tasks at work. A weekend where there aren't enough distractions to keep their mind occupied. And suddenly they find themselves wondering about you. How are you doing? Do you still have the same routines? Are you doing that thing you once talked about doing? Do you still live in the same place, or has your life changed in some way? These questions seem simple on the surface, but they appear much more often than this person would probably like to admit. What's interesting is that they're not just curious about your life. They're trying to figure out whether they still exist somewhere within your world. That's what really matters to them. There are days when they think they're okay, days when they tell themselves the story is over, days when they genuinely believe they've learned how to move forward. But then something reminds them of you, and all that calm starts to crack. Okay, the Devil card doesn't feel negative to me here. It feels more like being stuck inside a thought for too long. You know when a song gets trapped in your head? You aren't trying to remember it, but it keeps playing anyway. The more you try to ignore it, the clearer it becomes. The more you push it away, the stronger it returns. That's what this person seems to be experiencing. They've tried to explain everything logically. They've reminded themselves that life goes on. They've kept busy, focused on other goals, poured energy into other parts of their life. But every time things become just a little quieter around them, their mind drifts right back to the place they thought they had already left. And honestly, what occupies their thoughts the most isn't the past. It's your present. They wonder how much you've changed. They wonder if someone makes you smile more than they once did. They wonder if someone else is listening to the stories that only they used to hear. They wonder if someone is slowly stepping into an emotional space they once had access to. That's where the Nine of Swords card starts showing up more strongly. Not because they know what's happening, but because they don't. And sometimes not knowing gives the imagination more power than the truth itself. A period of silence can cause someone to create hundreds of different scenarios in their head. And honestly, that feels exactly like what this person is doing. They wonder if you still think about them. They wonder whether the feelings that once existed still mean anything to you now. They wonder if this silence is simply a pause, or if it's a sign that you're truly stepping into a completely different chapter of your life. And there's another feeling here that feels very human, a fear of being replaced. Not because they think you belong to them, not because they believe they have some claim over your life, but because for the first time they're realizing that your world doesn't stand still waiting for anyone. You're still growing, you're still changing, you're still meeting new people, you're still collecting new experiences. And that realization has made time feel much more important than it once did. Something inside them is no longer comfortable with simply watching from a distance. But at the same time, they don't fully know what to do with the emotions that continue to grow inside them. So they keep watching, they keep thinking, they keep asking questions that nobody seems able to answer. And the more they look towards you, the more it feels like a quiet pressure is building within them. Not a pressure connected to the past, but a pressure that comes from realizing something important. Because deep down, they're beginning to understand that if everything remains unspoken for too long, some conversations become harder to have, some words become heavier to carry, and some feelings become impossible to ignore. And as that pressure keeps building, this person is beginning to realize that the story between the two of you wasn't shaped solely by their own emotions. There were other voices involved, other opinions, other influences that slowly found their way into the situation. And honestly, some of the advice they listened to sounded reasonable at the time. But the further they've traveled down this road, the more they've started to understand that not everyone standing close to you truly understands what's happening inside your heart. The Justice card comes through with a very direct energy here. Not loud, not dramatic, not rushed. But it makes certain things much harder to avoid. It's almost like someone finally sitting down with themselves and asking a difficult question. What was real? What came from fear? And what beliefs were inherited from other people's opinions rather than their own truth? I keep getting the feeling that this person was influenced by their surroundings far more than they would like to admit. Maybe it was friends, maybe family, maybe an ex-partner, or maybe just people who always seem to have an opinion about what they should do. People telling them to be careful, to keep their distance, to avoid getting too emotional, to never let anyone see their vulnerabilities. And for a while, they listened. At least for a certain chapter of their life, they allowed those outside voices to become louder than the voice inside their own heart. Now, that doesn't mean they're trying to avoid responsibility. Actually, quite the opposite. The Justice card feels like a moment of accountability. A moment where they're beginning to understand their role in everything that happened. Because regardless of who influenced them, the final choices were still theirs. They were the one who stayed silent. They were the one who hesitated. They were the one who left you standing in uncertainty for far too long. And honestly, that's becoming harder for them to ignore. The Ten of Wands card appears here like someone carrying too much weight for too long. Weight they never fully acknowledged. Weight they kept insisting wasn't there. They may have spent a long time convincing themselves that none of this affected them, trying to prove they were fine, trying to continue with life as if nothing inside them had been shaken. But the longer that performance continued, the more exhausting it became. Not just because they miss you, but because maintaining an image that no longer matches how they truly feel requires an incredible amount of energy. Maybe they told other people it didn't matter. Maybe they said they'd already moved on. Maybe they insisted they rarely thought about you anymore. But deep down, those explanations are no longer convincing even to themselves. And wow, the Seven of Swords card reversed really stands out here. Because it feels like something that was hidden is slowly losing its ability to stay hidden. Maybe it's the truth about their feelings. Maybe it's part of the story you've never fully known. Maybe it's the reason they became distant, the reason they avoided certain conversations, the reason they allowed outside influences to affect their decisions. But what I find interesting is that this doesn't feel chaotic. It doesn't feel like a dramatic revelation crashing into everyone's lives. It's quieter than that. It's more like a curtain slowly being pulled back, little by little, just enough for them to stop pretending things were simpler than they really were. They're beginning to recognize who genuinely helped them grow and who kept pulling them back into old patterns. They're beginning to see that some people didn't necessarily dislike you, but they weren't comfortable with the changes that happened when this person started becoming a different version of themselves. Because whenever someone changes, the people who are familiar with the old version often have to change too, and not everyone welcomes that. So now there's a tension inside them. One side feels familiar, predictable, safe, even if it isn't truly fulfilling. The other side leads toward the connection they shared with you, a place where they would need to be more honest, more mature, more accountable for their emotions. And honestly, that's not always an easy choice, but it does seem to be a necessary realization, because they're no longer able to place all the responsibility on circumstances. They're beginning to understand that some obstacles existed outside of them, but others existed in the way they responded to those obstacles. And the clearer that truth becomes, the harder it is to return to the old version of silence. Because once you've seen something clearly, it's very difficult to pretend you've never seen it at all. And because they can no longer turn away from that truth, something inside them is beginning to shift. It's no longer just about missing you. It's no longer just about regret. It's no longer just those quiet conversations they've been having inside their own head. I keep feeling like something is being carefully prepared within them, almost like someone who has spent far too much time thinking and is now starting to wonder whether it's finally time to say something out loud. The Chariot card comes through with a sense of movement. But interestingly, this movement doesn't seem to begin on the outside. It begins internally, in their awareness, in their perspective. Because sometimes we know exactly what we need to do, and yet it still takes a very long time before we're truly ready to do it. Honestly, that feels like where this person is right now. They don't want everything to remain trapped in their thoughts anymore. They don't want to keep waking up to the same unanswered questions. They don't want to keep guessing what you're thinking or how you're feeling. The more they reflect on everything, the more they realize that some things can only be resolved through a real conversation. A conversation without walls, without half answers, without the avoidance they once used to protect themselves. And what's interesting is that they're not only thinking about the present, their mind keeps returning to everything that happened between the two of you. The Six of Cups card appears again here, and wow, it really feels like memory is playing a major role in the decisions they're making now. There are moments they look back on and smile. Conversations that lasted much longer than either of you planned. Moments when the two of you understood each other without needing to explain much at all. Little details that most people would never notice. And the strange thing is, the more they remember, the more they realize how much they once took for granted. Not because those memories were perfect, but because they were real. And as they've grown a little older, a little wiser, they're beginning to understand just how rare genuine connections really are. I also feel a very specific kind of anxiety here. This person doesn't just want to speak, they want to be heard. They want the chance to explain things they weren't brave enough or mature enough to express before. Because sometimes the things that haunt us most aren't the words we said. They're the words we kept inside. The apologies that were never sent. The feelings that were never acknowledged. The thoughts that never found their way into a conversation. And over time, those unspoken things begin to create a space that feels larger and larger. This person is starting to recognize that. They're beginning to understand that if they want to be seen differently, they can't rely only on what they're feeling internally. They need to show it, not through grand promises, not through emotional speeches, but through real change. The Ace of Pentacles card carries that energy so strongly. It's almost like they're telling themselves that if there is another opportunity to build something meaningful, they would want it to rest on a stronger foundation, a more mature one, a clearer one, less confusion, less emotional games, less misunderstanding, less silence stretching on for months at a time. Now, that doesn't mean they believe any of this would be easy. Actually, I feel like they understand better than anyone that trust takes time to rebuild if it's ever been damaged. But something has changed. Before, they may have viewed everything through the lens of being right, or winning, or protecting their pride. Now they're viewing it through the lens of sincerity. And honestly, that's a huge shift. There are nights when they think about that conversation, how it might begin, how you might respond, whether you'd even want to hear what they have to say, whether too much has changed. Those questions are still there. But what's different now is that those questions aren't stopping them the way they once did. Instead, they're teaching them something. They're helping them realize that some doors can only be opened through honesty. And I don't know why, but the more I sit with this energy, the more it feels like the idea of another chance to connect is becoming harder and harder for them to ignore. Because when they look back at this entire journey, they keep coming to the same realization. There is a conversation here that has been waiting far too long to happen. It almost feels like this person has been standing in front of the same door for far too long. A door they've known they needed to walk through. They've thought about it. They've weighed every possibility. They've convinced themselves to wait a little longer, and then a little longer after that. But the more time passes, the more something inside them keeps whispering that they can't stay where they are forever. And honestly, when the Tower card comes through here, I don't immediately think of chaos. I don't think of everything falling apart. What I actually feel is the breaking of stagnation. It's like someone who has lived inside the safety of silence for so long that one day they suddenly realize they don't want to live there anymore. Because sometimes the biggest changes look sudden from the outside, but they've been building quietly beneath the surface for a very long time. And that's exactly what this energy feels like. For you, Taurus, what's interesting is that if this movement begins to show itself, it may come from a direction you never expected, because the image you carry of this person may be based on who they've been in the past. Someone hesitant, someone guarded, someone who takes forever to make a decision, someone who keeps everything inside their head instead of speaking it out loud. But there are moments in life when not acting becomes harder than acting. And honestly, I feel like they're getting very close to that point. What stands out to me is that this doesn't feel overly calculated. It doesn't feel like some perfectly designed plan. It's more like a realization. A realization that they don't want to keep missing opportunities to say what needs to be said. The Wheel of Fortune card appears here like a wheel that has finally started turning after standing still for a very long time. Not because everything changes overnight, but because small things have been shifting quietly in the background for months, maybe even longer. And now those shifts are becoming impossible to ignore. This person may be moving through something similar. A conversation with someone, a recent experience, a new understanding, even something that seemed completely ordinary at the time. Yet somehow it caused them to see this entire story through a different lens. And sometimes that's all it takes. Just one moment, one realization, one unexpected perspective. Enough for someone to understand they no longer want to live inside assumptions. No longer want to keep wondering what might have happened if they had made a different choice. No longer want to watch time pass while important things remain exactly where they left them. What's fascinating here is that this doesn't feel impulsive at all. The Wisdom card carries a very different energy. It feels earned, like maturity that has been built through experience, through mistakes, through reflection, through lessons that couldn't be learned any other way. It's almost like this person is finally listening to themselves instead of listening only to fear. They're beginning to understand that clarity can sometimes be more valuable than comfort. That facing the truth may actually feel lighter than spending years wondering what the truth was. And wow, that creates a completely different energy. They're no longer the person simply watching from a distance. No longer the person keeping everything locked away inside their thoughts. No longer the person endlessly postponing what needs to happen. I keep getting the feeling that they're slowly approaching a decision they weren't ready to make before. And the thing that may surprise you most isn't necessarily the action itself. It may be who the action comes from. Because sometimes the last person we expect to make the first move ends up being the one who does. Sometimes the person we assume will remain silent becomes the one who can no longer stay quiet. I keep seeing the image of someone rehearsing a conversation over and over in their mind, changing the wording, replaying possible reactions, wondering whether the timing is right, wondering how it might be received. But unlike before, those thoughts no longer carry the energy of avoidance. They carry the energy of preparation. Preparation to step outside of a familiar role. Preparation to do something that would have seemed almost impossible to them just a few months ago. Because once the wheel begins to move, the things that have remained frozen for too long no longer feel comfortable sitting in silence. And honestly, that's where the energy of this story begins to feel different. Different from everything that came before. Like something within it has finally started to wake up. And honestly, what stands out to me most at this point isn't what this person is doing. It's what they're no longer able to keep hidden. Because when certain feelings first appear, we can set them aside. When certain thoughts first arrive, we can convince ourselves to ignore them. But when an emotion stays with us long enough, it slowly becomes part of everyday life. And eventually, hiding it becomes more exhausting than admitting it's there. The King of Cups card comes through with a very mature energy. Not explosive, not chaotic. Not emotionally out of control. Actually, it feels like the opposite. It feels like someone who has spent a very long time trying to manage their heart, trying to stay calm, trying not to react, trying to behave as though everything is perfectly under control. But over time, they're starting to realize something important. Feelings don't disappear just because we stop talking about them. I keep feeling like this person went through a long period of pretending they cared less than they actually did. Maybe they allowed you to believe that none of this mattered very much to them. Maybe they appeared colder than they truly felt. Maybe they stayed silent during moments when they should have said something. Not because they lacked feelings, but because those feelings made them feel vulnerable. And for some people, vulnerability is one of the hardest things to face. Because the moment you admit that someone matters to you, you also accept the possibility that they have the power to hurt you. And honestly, it feels like this person has spent a very long time trying to come to terms with that reality. The Temperance card carries a feeling of inner balance returning, not overnight, not all at once, but gradually. They're no longer reacting entirely from fear, no longer letting fear make every decision for them, no longer trying to prove that they don't need anyone. Instead, they're beginning to see emotions as something normal, something human, something that doesn't need to be hidden away, something that doesn't need to become a battle between the mind and the heart. And what's interesting is that when people stop fighting their feelings, they usually start seeing things much more clearly. And honestly, that's exactly what feels like it's happening here. This person is beginning to understand that what they miss isn't only a person. They miss the feeling of connection. They miss honest conversations. They miss the feeling of being themselves without needing so many walls around their heart. And the more they understand that, the more they realize there are things they never said to you. Thank yous that were never spoken. Apologies that were never sent. Truths that were never acknowledged. And wow, the World card reversed really catches my attention here. Because it reminds me of a book with a bookmark still resting in the final chapter. The story hasn't completely ended. But it doesn't feel fully complete either. Something remains unfinished. Not necessarily because the two of you haven't crossed paths again. Not necessarily because answers are missing. But because certain emotions have remained exactly where they were left a very long time ago. And it feels like this person is beginning to realize they don't want to carry those things forever. They don't want to keep wondering, what if I had been more honest? What if I had explained myself more clearly? What if I had found the courage to admit how I truly felt? What's interesting is that these questions no longer carry the energy of simple regret. They feel more like reminders. Reminders that sometimes the truth deserves to be spoken. Even when speaking it feels uncomfortable. Even when it feels risky. Even when it requires courage. And honestly, the big shift I see here is that this person seems less concerned with protecting their image than they once were. They're becoming more focused on protecting the things that genuinely matter to their heart. And that's a significant change. Because when someone stops running from what they truly feel, they often begin to notice a path that has been there all along. A path they spent a very long time trying not to look at. And I can't help but feel like that realization is quietly preparing the energy of this story to move into an entirely different chapter. And you know, not every story ends with a dramatic moment. There's no music swelling in the background. No perfect speech. No single day where everything suddenly becomes clear. Sometimes an old chapter closes in the quietest way imaginable, simply because two people finally begin seeing each other through truth instead of assumptions. Honestly, that's the very first feeling I get when I sit with this energy. The World card comes through carrying a sense of completion. Not completion in the sense that every problem has been solved. Not completion in the sense that every question has been answered. But completion in the sense that what needed to be understood finally has a chance to be understood. What needed to be spoken finally has a chance to be spoken. And the things that once existed between two people like unanswered questions slowly begin transforming into understanding. I also feel like you're arriving at a different perspective on this entire story. Because when we're in the middle of our emotions, certain things become difficult to see. We see everything through pain, through disappointment, through expectations that were never fulfilled. But time has a way of creating enough distance for us to look back with different eyes. And what's interesting is that this shift doesn't seem to be happening only on their side. It feels like it's happening on yours as well. There may be things you begin to understand that never fully made sense before. Reasons that once felt confusing. Reactions that once felt hurtful. Periods of silence that left you with more questions than answers. Not because those experiences need to be excused, but because you're beginning to see the entire picture rather than just one piece of it. The Judgment card carries this awakening so clearly. It's almost like two people standing on opposite sides of a bridge and finally realizing they were both carrying more misunderstandings than they ever knew. There were things that were never explained, things that were never asked, things each person interpreted in their own way. And over time, those empty spaces quietly created distance. But once light begins entering those spaces, everything starts to look different. Not because the past changes, but because the way we understand the past changes. And wow, that immediately brings me to the Chariot card. Because after everything that's happened, the energy no longer feels stuck. It feels like movement. It feels like life wanting to move forward again, not by returning to live inside the past, not by becoming trapped inside what should have happened, but by moving ahead with a deeper understanding of both yourself and each other. Because sometimes a new direction doesn't begin with a huge decision. Sometimes it begins with an honest conversation. A moment when someone finds the courage to say what they've truly been thinking. A moment when someone else finds the patience to listen instead of defending themselves. And it's amazing how those small moments can completely change the direction of a story. Then the Empress card appears here almost like the final breath of this reading. And honestly, this doesn't feel like the energy of lack. It doesn't feel like holding on desperately. It doesn't feel like chasing something at any cost. It feels like growth, confidence, a kind of peace that comes from knowing your own worth. And I feel like that's one of the most beautiful things you're carrying with you now. No matter how a conversation unfolds, no matter what direction things eventually take, you're no longer standing in the position of someone waiting to be chosen. You're no longer standing in the position of someone trying to prove their value. You're standing in the position of someone who knows who they are, someone who understands what they deserve. And honestly, that changes everything about your energy. Because sometimes a new chapter doesn't begin when another person enters our life. Sometimes it begins when we start seeing ourselves through completely different eyes. And when I look at the overall energy of this story as it comes to a close, I can't help but feel that far more has changed throughout this journey than either person may fully realize. Quiet changes, internal changes, the kind that happen slowly enough that we don't notice them right away. It's almost like after all the cycles, all the silence, all the unanswered questions, a new doorway is beginning to appear ahead. Not so the old story can repeat itself, but so a more honest version of that story finally has room to begin. My beautiful Gemini, thank you so much for being here with me today. If this message resonated with you, take what feels right for your journey and leave the rest. Remember, your story is still unfolding, and sometimes the answers we're looking for arrive in ways we never expected. Be kind to yourself, be patient with yourself, and most importantly, keep trusting your own inner wisdom. Thank you for sharing this space with me. I appreciate you more than you know. I'll see you in the next reading, Gemini. Until then, take care. Bye for now.